She did not slam a single door. That was the part no one would believe. Not her closest friends, not the gossip blogs that would spend 3 weeks dissecting the collapse of the Harrington Empire. And certainly not the man who had built his entire understanding of her around the assumption that she needed him too much to ever actually go. There was no screaming. No shattered glass. No scene. Just Naomi, standing in the center of a room that had cost more to furnish than most people earned in a decade. Making a decision so quiet and so permanent it felt less like a departure, and more like a verdict. The house sat on 11 private acres in the hills above the city, gated and floodlit, and surrounded by the kind of engineered silence money buys when it no longer wants to hear the world outside. From the master suite terrace, the city unfolded in every direction, towers and bridges and the dark ribbon of the river cutting through it all like a signature. Raymond Harrington had shown her that view on their third date, his arm extended toward the skyline like a man introducing her to something he owned. She had smiled at the right moment. She was always good at the right moment. Raymond was downstairs, asleep in the secondary suite with the woman he had stopped hiding 3 weeks ago. Not because he had grown careless. Because he had grown certain. The certainty of a man who had calculated the exit costs of his marriage and decided his wife had none. Naomi stood at the window of the study and did not look at the city. She looked at her own reflection in the glass, dark eyes steady, the burgundy silk of her dress catching the soft lamp light behind her. Her locks were pinned up the way she wore them to events that mattered to her, not to him. She had spent 2 hours getting dressed for a dinner that had been cancelled by a 4-word text at 7 p.m. No explanation. No apology. And no understanding, even now, of what that 4-word text had cost him. Her locks had gray at the temples, a thing she had refused to dye despite his comments. And in the lamplight against the dark glass, the silver strands caught like wire catching fire. She was 41 years old, and had never looked more like herself than she did at this moment. Removing the diamond tennis bracelet from her wrist one clasp at a time, she placed it on the desk. Then her wedding band. Then the engagement ring, 3 carats of cushion cut surrounded by a halo of smaller stones. The ring he had proposed with in a restaurant full of his investors. The ring she had understood even then was partly a performance. She arranged the 3 pieces in a precise line at the center of the desk blotter. It was the same precision she brought to everything. To the structural model that had underpinned his flagship development project. To the zoning variance argument that saved the Caldwell acquisition when his attorneys had declared it unsalvageable. To the 17 months of behind-the-scenes negotiation that delivered the Meridian Harbor deal. The deal Raymond had accepted a regional business award for at a gala she had not been invited to attend. She placed the envelope beside the jewelry. The divorce filing inside had been prepared by an attorney Raymond had never heard of, in an office 2 states away, paid for with money from an account she had opened 4 years ago when a quiet part of her had begun keeping contingencies. She had not been planning to leave. She had been planning to survive either way. She picked up the single bag she had packed 3 days ago and walked to the front door. She did not look back at the study. She did not look up the stairs toward where he was sleeping. She turned the handle, stepped into the night air, and let the door close behind her with the softest possible sound. Not a punctuation mark. A period at the end of a sentence she had been finishing for years. The night air was cool and clean with the particular crispness of hills above a city. No rain tonight. The sky was clear and starless in the way city skies always are. The stars traded long ago for the glow of 10,000 windows. Naomi stood at the top of the driveway and breathed in. She was not crying. She had not cried in this house in 2 years. She had made a private agreement with herself sometime in the 2nd year of the marriage that she would not give these walls the memory of her grief. The headlights appeared at the base of the drive. Not one set. 3. Black vehicles, low and wide and utterly silent on the approach, moving with the unhurried precision of a convoy that has never been in a hurry because it has never needed to be. They stopped. The lead vehicle's rear door opened. He stepped out alone, no security visible though she understood by now that it was always present, simply arranged in ways that did not announce itself. He crossed the distance between the car and where she stood without rushing, hands at his sides, posture relaxed in the specific way of a man who has not been surprised by anything in a very long time. He was in a dark jacket, collared shirt open at the throat, silver threading at his temples above the sharp angles of a face that gave almost nothing away except for the eyes, which gave away exactly what they chose to. He stopped in front of her and looked at her, and did not say anything for a moment. He simply looked, with a directness that was not intrusive, but that had no performance in it at all. "You look like someone who just remembered who she is," Jaewon said. Naomi looked at him. "I'm not interested in being romantic about this." "I'm not being romantic. I'm being accurate." He gestured toward the open door of the vehicle. "Come." She looked at the car, then back at the house, not in hesitation, in a final accounting. 11 acres and a skyline view and a man asleep in a secondary suite who would wake up at 6, go downstairs for coffee, walk past the study, and never once consider, not for a single moment, that this time she was actually gone. She stepped forward and got in the car. Here is the part that never makes it into the version people tell later. Not the departure. The moment 3 months before it when the decision became truly inevitable. Naomi had been in the boardroom on the 40th floor of Raymond's development firm, the one he referred to as his office but which she had quietly redesigned 2 years in for practical use, better acoustics, different furniture arrangement, the kind of changes that made a room work better without the person benefiting from it understanding why. She was there because Raymond had asked her to review a due diligence packet before his 9 a.m. She had arrived at 7:45, because she always arrived early, because that was the kind of woman she was. She was halfway through the 3rd financial exhibit when the door opened and 2 of his senior partners walked in mid-conversation, not expecting anyone to be there. She heard her name before they saw her. "He's not worried about the dilution. Naomi will just fix it. She always does." The voice was Tucker Harland, Raymond's CFO. A man who had once told her at a firm dinner that she was impressively sharp for someone without the formal background. She had smiled at the right moment. She was always good at the right moment. Does she even know what she's working with half the time? The second voice was younger. An associate Raymond had promoted 6 months ago. She knows enough to be useful. Tucker said it with the particular ease of a man who had stopped thinking of her as someone worth being careful around. Ray keeps her in the loop just enough to keep her happy. But she's not in the room when the real decisions get made. She's just good at the support work. She had not made a sound. She had sat very still in the chair at the head of the table, the due diligence packet open in front of her, and she had breathed evenly and let them find her when they finally looked up and saw her there, the blood draining from Tucker Harland's face with a speed that was almost satisfying. She had smiled. Briefly. Without warmth. "I'll let Raymond know the packet is ready," she said, and picked up her things and walked past them both. She did not confront Raymond. She did not need to. She had heard everything she needed to hear, not because of what Tucker said about her, but because of what Raymond had clearly been saying about her to these men for years. She was support work. She was not in the room when real decisions were made. She had heard him edit her into someone smaller, someone ancillary, to protect his own image in rooms she wasn't in. She had spent the drive home understanding that she had not been building a partnership. She had been financing a mythology in which she was a footnote. She had started the separation paperwork the next morning. Raymond woke at 6:14. His instinct was toward his phone, always toward his phone, the first thing and the last thing. He moved through the house in his robe already opening emails. He passed the study doorway without stopping. Then something in his peripheral vision pulled him back. He stood in the doorway and looked at the desk and looked at the jewelry and the envelope and the empty space where none of it should have been. He looked at it for a long time. Then he laughed. Not mean laughter. Disbelieving laughter. The laughter of a man confronting something that doesn't fit into any of his existing categories. He crossed to the desk and picked up the rings one at a time and turned them over, and then he opened the envelope and looked at the first page, and saw her signature at the bottom, and looked at it the way a man looks at something he does not yet understand is real. He had told Tucker Harland, at a firm dinner 8 days before, in a corner conversation he thought was private, "She's not going anywhere. She's too embedded here. She doesn't have a life that makes sense without the structure I provide." He had believed it completely. He had built a model of her inside his own mind, and then begun treating the model as definitive, stopped checking it against the actual woman, stopped noticing the updates. He had no idea how long ago the model had become useless. He put the papers back in the envelope. He put the rings in his robe pocket. He went to the kitchen and made coffee. "Give her a week," he said out loud to no one. He didn't know. He had no way of knowing. Because he had not been paying attention to her. Only to his version of her. The car moved through the pre-dawn city. Like it was the only thing moving in the world. Inside, the air was warm and still, and Naomi sat with her hands folded and watched the city passing outside the darkened glass. She felt, for the first time in years, that she was in a space that had not been arranged around someone else's comfort. Jae-won sat across from her, a black portfolio open on his knee, though he was not reading from it. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention she had first noticed 14 months ago, at the Linden Summit, where she had been seated 3 chairs down from him at a dinner for 12, and had watched him absorb everything in the room while appearing to be simply eating his meal. "The Valdres framework," he said. "The algorithmic risk model Raymond's acquisition team has been using for 3 years to evaluate distressed commercial properties." He paused. "You wrote it?" She didn't answer immediately. "How long have you known?" "Since I had it analyzed by 4 independent firms. None of them could replicate the underlying logic through any reconstruction of Raymond's stated team. The methodology is too particular, too elegant. It has a voice." He looked at her steadily. "It's your voice." She said nothing. "The Caldwell zoning strategy. The Meridian Harbor financing structure. The Hudson Corridor leaseback arrangement that saved the firm $38 million in a single quarter." He closed the portfolio. "Raymond accepted an award last spring for innovative deal architecture. I watched the speech from the back of the room. He thanked 8 people. You were not among them." "I wasn't supposed to be there," Naomi said. "I know," Jae-won said. "That's why I was watching." She looked at him then, fully, the way she had been carefully not looking at him for the past 14 months because she had known, some part of her had known, that fully looking would require decisions she wasn't ready to make. "What do you want from me?" she asked. The question was not unfriendly. It was just exact. "I want to know if you are willing to build something with your name on it." He reached into the portfolio and placed a single folder on the cushion between them. "I have a development fund. Fully capitalized. No institutional partners, no public record. I have been building a team for 2 years. Legal, structural, financial. Everyone on staff understands that the person at the top of this operation is the person who can do what that Valdres model did, which is see the whole problem at once." He let that settle. "The fund has no director. The operating seat has been empty for 8 months. I have not been in a hurry to fill it, because I have been waiting for the right person to no longer be somewhere else." Naomi looked at the folder without picking it up. "And the other part of this arrangement? You allow me to make sure no one disrupts what we're building while you're building it." "That's a careful way to say what you mean." "It is." The slightest softness at the corner of his jaw. "What I mean is that I have spent 14 months watching you carry a structure that did not deserve you, and I find that I am not indifferent to your safety. I would like the opportunity to not be indifferent to it in proximity." Naomi picked up the folder. She opened it. She read the first 2 pages in silence, and understood immediately that this had been constructed by someone who understood exactly what she could do because they had spent real time studying it. This was not an offer assembled for a woman walking away from a bad situation. This had been built in advance, around a very specific person, with a patience that said more than the offer itself. She closed the folder. She looked out the window at the city lightening at its edges with the first suggestions of morning. She thought about the boardroom and Tucker Harlan's voice, saying support work. She thought about Raymond, who would wake up shortly and find the desk and laugh, the genuine unfrightened laugh of a man who had no idea he was looking at the end. She picked up the folder and held it in her lap. "I need an office with good light," she said. "The entire eastern wall is glass," Jae-won said simply. She nodded. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. The car moved through the city, and the city began to wake around them, and ahead of them the office tower, where something new had been waiting for her, reflected the first edge of sunrise back at itself, like a mirror being held up to a very particular kind of beginning. 5 months is long enough for an empire to start forgetting what held it together. Raymond Harrington had spent May believing she would contact him, June believing she would surface somewhere he could access, July confronting the possibility, slowly and with enormous resistance, that she was not coming back and had never intended to. August sitting in a boardroom on the 40th floor watching Tucker Harland explain why the Valdres model had stopped producing reliable outputs. "It's not that the model is broken," Tucker said, not looking directly at Raymond. "It's that nobody on staff fully understands the input architecture. We can run it. We can't adapt it." Raymond sat at the head of the table in a suit that fit correctly, but sat on him differently now, as though the confidence that used to inhabit it had quietly left by a side door. Who built it? The silence that moved around the table then was a very particular kind of silence. The kind produced by a room full of people who all know the answer and are each waiting for someone else to say it. "We're looking into that," Tucker said carefully. The Caldwell portfolio flagged in August. A lease structure complication that Naomi had identified and corrected silently in the original documentation turned out to have a secondary clause that no one had preserved properly in the subsequent filing. Without her there to catch it, it had matured into a formal dispute that would take 7 months and significant legal fees to resolve. The Hudson Corridor Review exposed a similar pattern. A dozen places in the firm's infrastructure where her work had been load-bearing, invisibly, her fingerprints on the architecture of things Raymond had publicly claimed sole credit for. The woman in the guest suite left in June. Raymond did not tell anyone. He had told himself she would circle back when the social optics improved. She did not circle back. She had been very precisely calibrating risk for months, and the calculation had changed. He hired investigators in September. Not to find Naomi personally, he told himself, but to understand where she had gone, to get a sense of the landscape. The investigators were good. They came back in 8 days with a photograph and a name. Raymond looked at the photograph for a long time. Naomi, at the entrance of an event he did not recognize. In a gown the color of deep water, beside a man whose face he did not recognize, but whose presence in the image had the quality of someone who owned the room the event was being held in. He looked up the event. The Linden Foundation Gala. A closed annual gathering with no public list, no social coverage, no entry for uninvited guests. Raymond had heard of it. He had tried once to secure an invitation through Tucker's network and had been quietly redirected. The committee that managed access to this event operated at a level that Raymond had not yet reached, the level above regional influence, where wealth had stopped announcing itself entirely. She is there, he thought, as a plus one. Someone has brought her as a companion, and she is trading access for company. He constructed this explanation with speed and with conviction because the alternative, which was that Naomi had arrived in that room on her own terms, and was seated there as a principal, was an explanation his model of her could not hold. He told Davis to get him an invitation. Davis made calls that cost favors that would require time to repay. The invitation came on a Wednesday. Raymond held it, and felt the familiar forward momentum of a man who has identified a problem and located its address. He had the suit pressed. He repeated several times on the drive over that he was not going to beg. He was going to offer a reasonable professional arrangement. He was going to be generous about the terms. He told himself this in the car with the city moving past outside, the same city that had moved past a very different car 5 months earlier in the other direction. He straightened his cuffs. He had never once considered that she had not left into uncertainty. He had never once considered what had been waiting on the other side. The event occupied a private floor of a building that did not advertise itself. No signage outside, no photographers, no receiving line. You simply arrived at the address at the correct time, and were shown in by staff who managed the door with the quiet efficiency of people who had long ago stopped being impressed by anyone who came through it. Raymond noticed it immediately. The quality of the room. These were not people who were wealthy in the way he was wealthy. The way that still needed the visual markers, the watches and the cars and the venue choices. This was the register above that. The register where the markers had been abandoned because everyone present already knew. Conversations were low. Movement was unhurried. The dominant note in the room was the particular calm of people who had nothing left to demonstrate. He scanned for her. His eye moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who had built a career on reading spatial hierarchies. He found her in 4 minutes. She was near the center of the room. Not the windows, not the periphery, the center. And she was standing with 4 people who Raymond recognized with the slow, disorienting vertigo of a man encountering faces he has only ever seen in financial publications. Not mid-level contacts. Not the people who attended the events he attended. The actual tier above. And they were not including her in a conversation as a courtesy. They were facing her. They were receiving something from her. The lean of 4 exceptionally accomplished people slightly forward. The posture of an audience that does not want to miss anything. She was wearing a gown the color of deep water, structured and exact, the kind made by a single person for a single body after a conversation about what the body is and what the occasion demands. Her locks were down tonight, falling past her shoulders, the silver threads at her temples bright in the room's warm light. At her ears, geometric drops of dark stone. He did not recognize that somehow read as more significant than diamonds would have. Her posture was what stopped him completely. He had lived with this woman for 4 years. He had watched her in rooms. He knew her posture. This posture was not the one she wore in his rooms. This was the posture of someone who had been given enough space to fully extend into her own shape, and had discovered that the shape was much larger than what had been allowed before. He moved toward her. The crowd was not dense, but it had a texture, the texture of people who moved with the awareness of their own significance, and it slowed his approach without stopping it. She saw him coming. He could tell because she stopped speaking mid-sentence, which she never did. Her cadence was too controlled, which meant she had seen him, which meant she had needed a moment to decide how to hold her face. She decided on composed. She decided on correct. He reached the edge of the group. The 4 people with her looked at him with the polite, patient expressions of people who have not been introduced. Naomi looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, which was the expression of someone looking at something that used to have the power to alter their internal weather and noticing, with a kind of quiet curiosity, that it no longer does. "Raymond," she said. "Not warm, not cold. Accurate." "We need to talk," he said. He had intended to sound decisive. It came out with an edge of desperation he had not approved. "The firm is in a complicated position right now, and I think we can both see that there's a conversation worth having about how things were structured." He heard himself and understood that this was not the conversation he had rehearsed in the car. One of the 4 people with her, a woman in her 60s whose sovereign wealth fund had made her a figure of genuine global consequence, looked at Raymond with the mild interest of someone observing something without relevance to her. "The Valdres model," Raymond said, dropping the pretense of professional framing because there was nothing left to frame. "The Caldwell structure. The Meridian filing. I know it was yours. I need you to help me understand what's breaking and how to." "You filed for the Meridian Award using work you did not do," Naomi said. Her voice was level in a way that had nothing to do with suppression. It was level because she was not angry. She had moved past anger months ago into something far more stable. "You accepted recognition for work you could not have produced, and did not attempt to produce. You permitted your colleagues to describe me, while I was in the building, as support work. And then you spent 3 years building a picture of me as someone with no exit, which you shared with your partners as recently as this fall." She looked at him with complete clarity. "There is no version of this conversation where I help you. Naomi." He said it the way men say a name when they believe the name itself is still a lever. "You can't just walk away from everything we built." "You mean everything I built," she said. And it was not bitter. It was only true. From across the room, J1 had been watching since Raymond entered. He had not moved. He did not need to move. He had certain arrangements in place for contingencies he had identified months ago, when he had understood that Raymond's ego would eventually drive him to exactly this moment. He waited until the precise point of the conversation that required him. Then he crossed the room. He stopped beside Naomi without touching her, and looked at Raymond with the absolute absence of agitation. The look of a man who has processed this scenario at length and assigned it its correct level of significance. "Mr. Harrington," J1 said. His voice was quiet and unhurried, and carried in the hush of the room the way quiet things carry in quiet rooms. without effort, to every corner. You were not on the list for this event. He held Raymond's gaze without intensity, simply with the weight of someone who had been still for a long time, and had no intention of not continuing to be. The invitation you came in on was a courtesy extended through a third party. That courtesy has now been used. He nodded once to a point behind Raymond's right shoulder. Two men appeared. Not dramatically, simply accurately. They moved into position with the practiced neatness of people who have done this before, and prefer doing it before anything requires them to be less quiet about it. Raymond looked at them. He looked at Naomi. He looked at the four people behind her, who had not moved and had not changed their expressions, who were watching him with the patient attention of people at a remove from events that no longer had the power to surprise them. "This isn't over," Raymond said, and it came out thin, in the register of a man who knows it is over and is saying this final thing because stopping before saying it feels too much like admitting what he can already feel. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Not with triumph. With something older and quieter than triumph. The recognition of a woman standing on the far side of a door that has finished closing. "The divorce papers are filed," she said. "The asset review is complete. You have very good attorneys. You'll need them." She held his gaze for exactly as long as was necessary, and then returned her attention to the four people behind her, resuming the conversation she had interrupted to manage him, finding the thread she had dropped and lifting it back up with no visible effort at all. The two men guided Raymond Harrington out of the event with the smooth efficiency of a process that had been designed to be unremarkable. The door closed. The room resumed. Someone in the string quartet turned a page, and the music continued from where it had been. Jae-won stood beside Naomi and watched the door for a moment. Then he looked at her. She was finishing a sentence to the Sovereign Wealth Fund director, making a point with one hand, the lamplight catching the gray in her locks, looking precisely like herself. Later, when the room had thinned and the city below the windows had moved into its late-hour arrangement, Jae-won stood beside her at the glass, and they both looked at the city for a while without saying anything. He turned toward her and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, with attention that had no transaction in it, attention that had been given freely long ago and had stayed. "I want to introduce you," he said, "in the way you should have been introduced a long time ago." Naomi looked at him. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." A pause. "I want to." He turned to the room and spoke without volume, but the room was the kind of room that listened when someone with Jae-won's gravity chose to speak, and the quiet organized itself naturally around his voice. "I would like to introduce the architect of the Valdres Risk Framework, the lead structural mind behind 3 of the most sophisticated commercial real estate transactions completed in this region in the past 4 years, and the founder and operating director of Harrow Capital Analytics, which in its first 6 months of operation has already outperformed every fund in its class." He paused. "She has been the most capable person in every room she has entered for a decade. Tonight she is in the right room. And tonight you know her name." He said her name. The room did not erupt. This was not a room that erupted. But the recognition that moved through it was real, the kind that travels not through volume, but through the forward lean of very accomplished people simultaneously understanding that they need to position themselves closer to whatever comes next. The Sovereign Wealth Fund director began to applaud. The room followed. And the sound of it was not the sound of an audience. It was the sound of a peer group meeting someone who had been one of them all along. Naomi stood in the light of the city she had spent years helping to shape, in a gown that had been made for her, beside a man who had spent more than a year learning the architecture of her intelligence before he said a single word about it. And she felt moving through her chest something she had not felt in so long she had briefly considered the possibility it was gone. She felt correctly located. She felt like the full version of herself. The version that had been present the whole time, waiting with extraordinary patience for adequate space. She smiled and it reached her eyes, and it was nothing at all like the smile she had worn in a boardroom hallway while Tucker Harlan said the word useful. That smile had been a door closing. This one was every room on the other side. Some people will watch you quietly correct their mistakes and call it dedication. They will watch you solve the problems they cannot solve and explain it as loyalty. They will build a narrative in which your brilliance is a feature of their story rather than the center of your own. And they will do it with such consistency, for such a long time, that you may begin to wonder if the narrative is true. It is not true. There is a version of you that exists entirely outside the frame someone else built for you. And the moment you step outside it, really step outside it, with your files in order and your name on the work and a quiet, clear, non-negotiable understanding of what you are worth, everything recalibrates. You don't leave in anger. Anger has already passed by the time you leave. You leave in clarity. You leave the way a river leaves a channel that has gotten too narrow, not in violence, in the irresistible direction of its own nature. And here is the thing about work that is genuinely excellent. It does not stop being excellent because someone with insufficient standing failed to see it. It does not require their credit to remain real. It simply waits, the way all true things wait, for the structure around it to catch up to what it already is. Drop a crown in the comments if you know Naomi earned everything that happened in that room. And if you want to see what Harrow Capital builds next, subscribe right now, because this story is just getting started, and you do not want to walk in after it's already made history.